way. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous, I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in heaven, in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object, there was none. Passion, there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold, I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation. I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed that so no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in, and moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight, but I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by his name in a hearty tone and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than mine did. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door little by little, he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly as if startled. Now, you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was black as pitch with the thick darkness, but the shutters were close-fastened through fear of robbers, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in bed, listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no! It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from me in mine own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo. The terrors that distracted me, I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had heard and turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor, or it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him, and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot out from the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones, but I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon that damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I maintained the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say louder at every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous, so I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and watched it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught it all. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart. For what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police station, and they, the officers, had been dispatched to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things, but ere long I felt myself growing pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat, and still they chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much as a sound the watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers had not heard it. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men. But the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of horror. This I thought, and this I think, but anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now, again, hark, louder. Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more, I admit the deed. I tear up the planks. Here is the beating of his hideous heart. And that is the Telltale Heart. I think we will go with the Masque of Red Death next, because, I mean, I am all for a good mask, after all. The Pin the Pendulum, I feel like used to be his most popular story, and then actually started to lose a certain amount of prestige over time compared to the Telltale Heart. Though, to be fair, the pendulum is significantly longer and requires some knowledge of the Inquisition to fully get, so I can see how that level might make it slightly less appealing. One moment, I'm just going to have a drink and then we can get started with the Masque of the Red Death. Okay, and so as I said last time, if anyone comes in, please use the story command to let them know that I will respond. Oh, simply water for the night. No, please don't eat rocks, Quentin. But let's get started with the Masque of Red Death. This is actually the first Edgar Allan Poe story I read when I first woke up, so I'm glad to get to share it with you all now. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar, and its seal the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then a profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men, and the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. The wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulse of despair or the frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned with such precautions the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was towards the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, the masquerade. But first, let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the wall on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here, the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the visions embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were stained glass whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the seven apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from the lamp or candles within the suite of chambers, but in the corridors that followed the suite there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass so glaringly illuminated the room, and thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that, at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance, to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and, while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But, when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if their own nervousness and folly and made whispering vows to each other that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar motion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and the conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the seven chambers upon occasion of this great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what had been since seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the seven chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these the dreams ride in and about, taking you from the rooms and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps, and anon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet, and then for a moment all is still, and all is silent, save for the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away, and they have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now against the music swells, and the dreams live and ride to and fro more merrily than ever, taking you from the many tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods, but to the chamber which lies most westwardly. Of the 7, there were now none of the maskers who ventured, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears who indulge in a more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went whirlingly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolution of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled. And thus too it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before, and the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz of murmur expressively disapprobation and surprise, and finally terror of horror and disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the heart of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion, even with the utterly lost to whom life and death are equally jests. There are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company indeed seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat, and yet all this might have been endured, if not approved by the mad revelers around, but the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow with all the features of the face were besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of his courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of the group in the direction of the intruder who, at the moment, was also near at hand, and now with deliberate and stately step made closer approach to the speaker, but from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth a hand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and, while the vast assembly, as if one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber, to the purple, through the purple, to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, grasped an unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they handled with so violent a rudeness, unattended by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. So that is our second story for the night. You can see how it touches upon several things that might be of interest to me. Let's see. Hello, Lambda. Thank you for joining us. It is good to see you. Welcome to the Apothecary. It is a rather fantastic story, and one that is underappreciated, I feel. It is still one of the more mainstream stories, but in the same point, it is not as known as the Telltale Heart or Pit of the Pendulum or the Raven. I do like the idea of a phantasmagoric ball with all of these dreamlike revelers that have escaped what they think to their safety, but have in fact brought themselves to their own doom. I have considered, at some point, redecorating Crane Manor to have the passages and rooms similar to how Prince Prospero had them set up. I do think it would be rather entertaining, and in fact, I've wanted to do that sort of decoration before, but I have not had the time to indulge it. So if anyone knows where to get a giant ebony clock, I might be looking for one. I'm glad it's one of your favorites. What would you say your favorite Poe story is, Lambda? Let's see. So, thus far we have done the Telltale Heart and the Masque of Red Death. The Black Cat. That makes sense for you. I probably should have guessed that. Yes. Excellent. I do love hot chocolate. Do you take it with whipped cream or marshmallows, though? That is the question. And is it hot chocolate or drinking chocolate? I actually just got some drinking chocolate the other day when I saw that there was the chance for snow coming to Crane Manor. And I thought it would be wonderful to get to relax indoors with a nice book and some drinking chocolate. It is the type of time of year. That is completely fair. Chocolate is okay. Hmm. I have seen some people do hot chocolate where they use a candy cane to stir it to get that sort of peppermint, but in fact, I do, because I grow my own mint. So I have done both muddled hot chocolates with a chocolate mint, and I also make mint extracts. And so I have been known to put a touch of chocolate mint extract into hot chocolate. And that if you've not tried that before, it is truly an enjoyable experience. Oh, yeah, cinnamon and nutmeg. That reminds me kind of the Mexican hot chocolate that has that very nice spice to it. That's also very warming on a winter's day. I actually find that to be preferable normally. That bit of spice makes cuts the sweetness of the chocolate, but you do that with a dark chocolate one, and it is almost sinful how delicious it can be. You do have to be careful keeping that around, just because it will disappear. If not me, Bonk also has a sweet tooth, so it is imperative not to let him have too many sweets, otherwise he is liable to start bouncing off the walls as well as the tables. Yes, Kaya. I have seen someone rather foolishly not understand the flavor palette for that kind of cocoa and thought that it was much spicier than it was, so they added ghost pepper extract to it. As you can guess, that did not turn out the way they were hoping. But I also have to say, yes, exactly. I am very fond of a nice hot apple cider uh, brewing away. Oh, absolutely. He does like peppermint and spearmint, and he's gotten a strange fascination with pineapple mint, which, of course, he has to enjoy the one that is hardest to grow because it is the most delicate, but at the same time, you know, it is worth it to make him happy. I'm not always austere with him, only when he is trying to handle my equipment or is dealing in the arts of alchemy. One cannot be too careful when dealing with such topics. That is how one ends up turning themselves into soot, and I do not want to have to clean that up. So, soot is, yes, that's pretty much what we do. You get, I found some ways to make very colorful rubber that is very bouncy. He likes to bounce it off the walls and play with it like that. And then you throw some mint or chocolate his way, and he is content as can be. It is nice because that gives a break from her. He is not staining my books with the ink anymore. Yes, I do hope eventually you will be able to meet Bonk at these events. Right now, he is still a little camera shy, even though he's the one that had to set most of this up, as really I'm just talking into this camera and apparently this is working, but I'm seeing things pop up and people talking as he says that is what is happening, so I have to assume that either this is a prank that is far beyond his normal ken, or otherwise is, in fact, set up properly. Hopefully one day I will be able to convince him to come on stream as well, so he can say hello to everyone. Okay. I will never turn down an opportunity to drink some wine. So. Which is one of the reasons my favorite story by Edgar Allan Poe is the Cask of Amontillado. But before we get to that one, I thought we might change up. Oh no. Don't break the maraca, Koso. That is so sad. You just got it. Oh, people are just having problems left and right. I mean, as long as the cup was not full of, I don't know, what, are you working with, like, acid at this time of night? It's a bit late, but I could see, science waits for no person. But if it's still edible, I won't judge. Sometimes you just have to give it a little sip. But I thought before we get into another tale of madness, we might explore the scientific method a little from Poe's writing. That is, you can fix pretty much anything in the world with WD-40 and duct tape. If it moves and it's not supposed to, duct tape. If it does not move, and it should, WD-40. Not quite as strong as some universal solvents to bind things, but at the same time, it is much easier to produce. So, speaking of the scientific method, I thought the next story for the night would be the Purloined Letter. This is one of Poe's detective stories, and not the same vein of horror as others. I do enjoy the mystery and thought process here. So, let me take another drink and then we will get started. I will say this is a longer story, so I hope people can get themselves comfortable and settle in to enjoy the tale. The Purloined Letter. And as before, if anyone comes by, I would of course appreciate using the story command to inform them that I will address any comments or new events between stories. But until then, at Paris, just after dark one gusty evening in the autumn of 18, I was enjoying the twofold luxury of meditation and a meerschaum, in company with my friend C, Auguste Dopin, and his little back library or book closet au troisième number 33 Rue du Nord Faubourg Saint-Germain. For 1 hour at least we had maintained a profound silence, while each to any casual observer might have seemed intently and exclusively occupied with the curling eddies of smoke that oppressed the atmosphere of the chamber. For myself, however, I was mentally discussing certain topics which had formed matter for conversation between us at an earlier period of the evening. I mean the affair of the Rue Morgue, and the mystery attaining the murderer of Marie Roget. I looked upon it, therefore, as something of a coincidence, when the door of our apartment was thrown open and admitted our old acquaintance, Monsieur G, the prefect of the Parisian police. We gave him a hearty welcome, for there was nearly half as much of the entertaining as of the contemptible about the man, and we had not seen him for several years. We had been sitting in the dark, and Dupin now arose for the purpose of lighting a lamp, but sat down again without doing so, upon G's saying that he had called to consult us, or rather to ask the opinion of my friend, about some official business which had occasioned a great deal of trouble. "If it is any point requiring reflection," observed Dupin, as he forebore to enkindle the wick, "we shall examine it better, purpose in the dark." "That is another of your odd notions," said the prefect, who had a fashion of calling everything odd that was beyond his comprehension, and thus lived amid an absolute legion of oddities. "Very true," said Dupin as he supplied his visitor with a pipe and rolled towards him a comfortable chair. "And what is the difficulty now?" I asked. "Nothing more in the assassination way, I hope." "Oh, no, nothing of that nature. In fact, it is very simple indeed, and I make no doubt that we can manage it sufficiently well ourselves, but then I thought Dupin would like to hear the details of it because it is so excessively odd." "Simple and odd," said Dupin. "Why, yes, not exactly that either. The fact is, we have all been a good deal puzzled because the affair is so simple, yet it baffles us altogether." "Perhaps it is the very simplicity of the thing which puts you at fault," said my friend. "What nonsense you do talk," replied the prefect, laughing heartily. "Perhaps the mystery is a little too plain," said Dupin. "Oh, good heavens, who has ever heard of such a thing? A little too self-evident." Roared our visitor, profoundly amused. "Oh, Dupin, you'll be the death of me yet." "And what, after all, is the matter at hand?" I asked. "Why, I will tell you," replied the prefect as he gave a long, steady, and contemplative puff and settled himself into a chair. "I will tell you in a few words, but before I begin, let me caution you that this is an affair demanding the greatest secrecy, and that I should probably lose the position I now hold were it known that I confided it to anyone." Proceed," said I. "Or not," said Dupin. "Well, then, I have received personal information from a very high quarter that a certain document of the last importance had been purloined from the royal apartments. The individual who purloined it, it is known. This, beyond a shadow of a doubt, he was seen to take it. It is also known that he still remains in its possession." "How is this known?" asked Dupin. "It is clearly inferred," replied the prefect, "from the nature of the document, and from the non-appearance of certain results that would have at once risen from the passing out of the robber's possession. That is to say, from his employing it as he must do, in the end, to employ it." "Be a little more explicit," I said. "Well, I may venture so far as to say that the paper gives its holder a certain power, or a certain quarter, where such power is immensely valuable," said the prefect, "was fond of the cant of diplomacy." "Still, I do not quite understand," said Dupin. "No? Well, the disclosure of the document to a third person, who shall be nameless, would bring into question the honor of personages of most exalted station. And this fact gives the holder of the document an ascendancy over the illustrious personage whose honor and peace are so jeopardized." "But this ascendancy," I interposed, "would depend on the robber's knowledge of the loser's knowledge of the robber. Who would dare?" "The thief," said G, "is the Minister D, who dares all things, those becoming as well as those becoming of a man. The method of the theft was not less ingenious than bold. The document in question, a letter, to be frank, had been received by the personage robbed while alone in the royal boudoir. During its perusal, she was suddenly interrupted by the entrance of other exalted personage, from whom especially it was her wish to conceal it. After a hurried and vain endeavor to thrust it in a drawer, she was forced to place it, open as it was, upon a table. The address, however, was uppermost, and the contents thus unexposed, the letter escaped notice. At this juncture enters the Minister D. His lynx eye immediately perceives the paper, recognizes the handwriting of the address, observes the confusion of the personage addressed, and fathoms her secret. After some business transaction hurried through in his ordinary manner, he produced a letter, somewhat similar to the one in question, opens it, pretends to read it, and then places it in close juxtaposition towards the other. Again he converses for some 15 minutes upon the public affairs. At length, in taking leave, he also takes from the table the letter to which he had no claim. Its rightful owner saw, but of course she dared not call attention to the act in the presence of the third personage, who stood at her elbow. The minister decamped, leaving his own letter, one of no importance, upon the table. "Here, then," said Dupin to me, "you have precisely what you demand to make the ascendancy complete. The robber's knowledge of the loser's knowledge of the robber." "Yes," replied the prefect, "and the power thus attained has for some months past been wielded for political purposes to a very dangerous extent. The personage robbed is more thoroughly convinced every day of the necessity of reclaiming her letter. But this, of course, cannot be done openly. In fine, driven to despair, she has committed the matter to me." "Then whom," said Dupin, amid a perfect whirlwind of smoke, "no more sagacious agent could I suppose be desired, or even imagined." "You flatter me," replied the prefect, "but it is possible that some opinion may have been entertained." "It is clear," said I, "as you observe, that the letter is still in possession of the minister, since it is this possession and not the employment of the letter which bestows the power. With the employment, the power departs." "True," said she, and upon this conviction I proceeded. My first care was to make a thorough search of the minister's hotel, and here my chief embarrassment lay in the necessity of searching without his knowledge. Beyond all things, I have been warned of the danger which would result from him giving reason to suspect our design. "But," said I, "you are quite au fait with these investigations. The Parisian police have done this thing often before." "Oh, yes, and for this reason I did not despair. The habits of the minister gave me, too, a great advantage. He is frequently absent from home all night. His servants are by no means numerous. They sleep at a distance from his master's apartment, and being chiefly Neapolitans, are readily made drunk. I have keys, as you know, with which I can open any chamber or cabinet in Paris. For 3 months a night has not passed, during the greater part of which I have not been engaged, personally, in ransacking the D Hotel. My honor is interested, and, to mention a great secret, the reward is enormous. So I did not abandon the search until I had become fully satisfied that the thief is a more astute man than myself. I fancy that I have investigated every nook and corner of the premises in which it is possible that the paper can be concealed." "But is it not possible," I suggested, "that although the letter may be in possession of the minister, it is unquestionably is, he may have concealed it elsewhere than upon his own premises?" "This is barely possible," said Dupin. "The present peculiar condition of the affairs at court, and especially of those that intrigues in which Mr. D is known to be involved, would render the instant availability of the document, its susceptibility of being produced at a moment's notice, a point of nearly equal importance with its possession." "Its susceptibility to being produced," said I. "That is to say, of being destroyed," said Dupin. "True," I observed. "The paper clearly then is upon the premises. As for its being upon the person of the minister, we may consider that out of the question?" "Entirely," said the prefect. "He had been twice waylaid, as if by footpads, and his person rigorously searched under my own inspection." "You might have spared yourself the trouble, Dupin. D, I presume, is not altogether a fool, and if not, must have anticipated these waylayings as a matter of course." "Not altogether a fool," said she, "but then he is a poet, which I take to be only one remove from a fool." "True," said Dupin, after a long and thoughtful whiff from his meerschaum, "although I have been guilty of certain doggerel myself." "Suppose you detail," said I, "the particulars of your search." "Why, the fact is, we took our time, and we searched everywhere. I have had long experience in these affairs. I took the entire building, room by room, devoting the nights of whole weeks to each. We examined first the furniture in each room. We opened every possible drawer, and I presume you know that, to properly trained police agents, such a thing as a secret drawer is impossible. Any man who is adult who permits a secret drawer to escape him in a search of this kind. The thing is so plain, there is a certain amount of bulk of space to be accounted for in every cabinet. Then we have accurate rules, the 50th part of a line could not escape us. After the cabinets, we took the chairs. The cushions we probed with fine, long needles you'll see me employ. From the tables, we removed the tops. Why so? Sometimes the top of the table, or a similarly arranged piece of furniture, is removed by the person wishing to conceal an article. Then the leg is excavated, the article deposited within the cavity, and the top replaced. The bottoms and tops of the bedposts are employed the same way. But could not the cavity be detected by sounding? I asked. Oh, by no means, if the article, when deposited, a sufficient wadding of cotton be placed around it. Besides, in our case, we were obliged to proceed without noise. But you could not have taken to pieces all articles of furniture in which it would have been possible to make a deposit in this manner you mention. A letter may be compressed into a thin spiral roll, not differing much in shape or bulk from a large knitting needle. And in this form, it might be inserted into the rung of a chair, for instance. You did not take to pieces all the chairs. Oh, certainly no, but we did better. We examined the rungs of every chair in the hotel, and indeed the jointings of every description of furniture. By the aid of a most powerful microscope, had there been any traces of recent disturbance, we should have not failed to detect it instantly. A single grain of gimlet dust, for example, would have been as obvious as an apple. Any disorder in the gluing, any unusual gaping in the joints would have been sufficed to ensure detection. I presume you looked into the mirrors between the boards and the plates, and you probed the sheets and the beds and the bedclothes, as well as the curtains and the carpets. That, of course, and when we had absolutely completed every particle of the furniture this way, we then examined the house itself. We divided its entire surface into compartments, which we numbered, so that none may be missed. Then we scrutinized each individual square inch throughout the premises, including the two houses immediately adjoining with a microscope as before. The two houses adjoining, I exclaimed. You must have had a great deal of trouble. We had, but the reward offered is prodigious. You include the grounds about the houses? All the grounds are paved with bricks. They give us comparatively little trouble. We examined the moss between the bricks and found it undisturbed. You looked among these papers, of course, and into the books of the library? Certainly. We opened every package and parcel. We not only opened every book, but we turned over every leaf in each volume, not contenting ourselves with a mere shake, according to the fashion of some of our police officers. We also measured the thickness of every book cover, with the most accurate measurement, and applied to each the most jealous scrutiny of the microscope. Had any of the bindings been recently meddled with, it would have been utterly impossible that the fact should have escaped observation. Some 5 or 6 volumes, just from the hands of the binder, we carefully probed longitudinally with the needles. You explored the floors beneath the carpets? Beyond doubt, we removed every carpet and examined the boards with the microscope. And the paper on the walls? Yes. And looked in the cellars? We did. Then I said, you have been making a miscalculation. The letter is not upon the premises, as you suppose. I fear you are right there, said the prefect. And now, Dupin, what would you advise me to do? To make a thorough research of the premises. That is absolutely needless, replied G. I am not more sure that I breathe and that the letter is not at the hotel. I have no better advice to give you, Dupin. You have, of course, an accurate description of the letter. Oh, yes, and here the prefect, producing a memorandum book, proceeded to read aloud a minute accounting of the internal, and especially the external appearance of the missing document. Soon, after finishing the perusal of the description, he took his departure, more entirely depressed in spirits than I had ever known the good gentleman before. In about a month afterwards he paid us another visit, and found us occupied very nearly as before. He took a pipe and a chair, and entered into some ordinary conversation. At length I said, Well, G, what of the Purloined Letter? I presume you have at last made up your mind that there is no such thing as overreaching the minister. Confound him, I say. Yes, I made a re-examination, however, as Dupin suggested, but it was all labor lost, as I knew it would be. How much is the reward offered, did you say, Dupin? Why, a very great deal, a very liberal reward. I don't like saying how much precisely, but one thing I will say, I wouldn't mind giving away my individual check for 50,000 francs to anyone who could obtain me that letter. The fact is, it is becoming more and more important every day, and the reward has been lately doubled. If it were trebled, however, I could do no more than I had done before. Why, yes, said Dupin, drawing between the whiffs of his meerschaum. I really think, G, you have not exerted yourself to the utmost in this matter. You might do a little more, I think, eh? How? In what way? Why, puff, puff, you might, puff, puff, employ counsel in the matter, eh? Puff, puff, puff. Do you remember the story they tell of Abernathy? No, hang Abernathy. To be sure, hang him and welcome. But once upon a time, a certain rich miser conceived the design of spurging upon the Abernathy for a medical opinion. Getting up for the purpose an ordinary conversation in a private company, he insinuated his case to the physician as that of an imaginary individual. We will suppose, said the miser, that his symptoms are such and such. Now, doctor, what would you have directed him to take? Take, said Abernathy. Why, take advice, to be sure. But, said the prefect, a little disconnected, I'm perfectly willing to take advice, and to pay for it. I would really give 50,000 francs to anyone who would aid me in this matter. In that case, replied Dupin, opening a drawer and producing a checkbook, you may as well fill me up a check for the amount mentioned. When you have signed it, I will hand you the letter. I was astounded. The prefect appeared absolutely thunderstricken. For some minutes he remained speechless and motionless, less looking incredulously at my friend with open mouth and eyes that seemed starting from their sockets. Then, apparently in some measure, he seized a pen, and after several pauses and vacant stares, finally filled up and signed a check for 50,000 francs, and handed it across the table to Dupin. The latter examined it carefully and deposited it into his pocketbook, then, unlocking an escritoire, took thence a letter and gave it to the prefect. The functionary grasped it in a perfect agony of joy, opened it with a trembling hand, cast a rapid glance at its contents, and then, scrambling and struggling to the door, rushed at length unceremoniously from the room and from the house, without having uttered a syllable since Dupin had requested him to fill up the check. When he had gone, my friend entered into some explanations. The Parisian police, he said, are exceedingly able in their way. They are persevering, ingenious, cunning, thorough, versed in the knowledge which their duties seem chiefly to demand. Thus, when G detailed to us the mode of his searching the premises of the Hotel D, I felt entire confidence in his having made a satisfactory investigation, so far as his labors extended. So far as his labors extended, said I. Yes, said Dupin. The measures adopted were not only the best of their kind, but carried out to absolute perfection. Had the letter been deposited within the range of their search, these fellows would, beyond a question, have found it. I merely laughed, but he seemed quite serious in all that he said. The measures, then, he continued, were good in their kind and well executed. Their defect lay in their being inapplicable to the case and to the man. A certain set of highly ingenious resources are, with the prefect, a sort of Procrustean bed to which he forcibly adapts his designs, but he perpetually errs by being too deep or too shallow for the matter at hand, and many a schoolboy is a better reasoner than he. I knew one about 8 years of age, whose success at guessing in the game of even and odd attracted universal admiration. This game is simple, and is played with marbles. One player holds his hand a number of these toys, and demands another whether that number is even or odd. If the guess is right, the guesser wins one. If wrong, he loses one. The boy whom I allude won all the marbles of his school. Of course, he had some principle of guessing, and this lay in mere observation and measurement of the astuteness of his opponents. For example, an errant simpleton in his opponent, and holding up his closed hand, asks, "Are they even or odd?" Our schoolboy replies odd, and loses, but upon the second trial he wins, for then he says to himself the simpleton has made them even first upon the first trial, and his amount of cunning is just sufficient to make him have them odd upon the second. I will, therefore, guess odd. He guesses odd, and wins. Now with a simpleton a degree above this, he would have reasoned thus. This fellow finds that in the first instant I guessed odd, and in the second he will propose himself upon the first impulse a simple variation from even to odd, as did the first simpleton. But then a second thought will suggest that this too is a simple variation, and finally he will decide upon putting it even, as before. I will therefore guess even, guesses even, and wins. Now this mode of reasoning in the schoolboy, whom his fellows term lucky, what, in its last analysis, is it? It is merely, I said, an identification of the reasoner's intellect with that of his opponent. It is, said Dupin, and upon inquiring of the boy by what means he effected through identification in which his success consisted, he received an answer as follows. When I wish to find out how wise, or how stupid, or how good, or how wicked anyone, or what his thoughts are at the moment, I fashion the expression of my face as accurately as possible in accordance with the expression of his, and then wait to see what thoughts or sentiments arise in my mind or heart, as if to match or correspond with the expression. This response of the schoolboy lies at the bottom of all the spurious profundity which has been attributed to Rochefoucauld, to La Bougive, to Machiavelli, and to Campanella, and the identification, I said, of the reasoner's intellect with that of his opponent depends, if I understand you aright, upon the accuracy with which his opponent's intellect is admeasured. For its practical value, it depends upon this, replied Dupin, and the prefect and his cohort fall so frequently, first, by default of this identification, secondly, by ill admeasurement, or rather through non-admeasurement of the intellect with which they are engaged. They consider only their own ideas of ingenuity, and in searching for anything hidden, advert only to the modes in which they would have hidden it. They are right in this much, that their own ingenuity is a faithful representative of that of the mass, but when the cunning of the individual felon is diverse in character from their own, the felon foils them, of course. This always happens when it is above their own, and very usually when it is below. They have no variation of this principle in their investigations. At best, when urged by some unusual emergency, by some extraordinary reward, they extend or exaggerate their old modes of practice without touching the principles. What, for example, in this case of D, has been done to vary the principle of action? What is all this boring and probing and sounding and scrutinizing with the microscope and dividing the surface of the building into registered square inches? What is it all but an exaggeration of the application of one principle or set of principles to search, which are based upon the set of notions regarding human ingenuity, to which the prefect, in the long routine of his duty, had been accustomed? Do you not see that he has taken it for granted that all men proceed to conceal a letter, not exactly in a gimlet hole bored in a chair leg, but at least in some hole or corner suggested by the same tenor of thought which would urge a man to secret a letter in a gimlet hole bored by a chair leg? And do you not see also that such recherche nooks for concealment are adapted only for ordinary occasions and would be adopted only for ordinary intellects? For in all cases of concealment, a disposal of the article concealed, a disposal of it in this recherche manner is, in its very first instance, presumable and presumed, and thus its discovery depends not at all upon the acumen, but altogether upon the mere care, patience, and determination of the seekers. And where the case is of importance, or what amount to the same thing in the policial eyes, when the reward is of the magnitude, the qualities in question have never been known to fall. You would now understand what I meant in suggesting that he had purloined the letter, had been hidden anywhere within the limits of the prefect's examination. In other words, had the principle of its concealment been comprehended within the principles of the prefect, its discovery would have been a matter altogether beyond question. This functionary, however, has been thoroughly mystified, and the remote source of his defeat lies in the supposition that the minister is a fool because he had acquired renown as a poet. All poets are fools. This the prefect feels, and he is merely guilty of a non-distributio medi, in thence inferring that all poets are fools. But is this really the poet, I ask? There are two brothers, I know, and both have attained reputation in letters. The minister, I believe, has written learnedly on differential calculus. He is a mathematician and no poet. You are mistaken. I know him well. He is both a poet and a mathematician. He would reason well. As mere mathematician, he could not have reasoned at all, and thus would have been at the mercy of the prefect. You surprise me, I said, by these opinions which have been contradicted by the voice of the world. You do not mean to set at naught the well-digested idea of centuries. The mathematical reason has long been regarded as the reason par excellence. Il y a un période, replied Dupin, quoting from Chamfort, que toute idée publique de convention recourt aux sottises car elle est convenue au plus grand nombre. The mathematicians, I grant you, have done their best to promulgate the popular error to which you allude, and which is none the less an error for its promulgation. As truth, with an art worthy a better cause, for example, they have insinuated the term analysis into the application of algebra. The French are the originators of this particular deception. But if a term is of any importance, if words derive any value from applicability, then analysis conveys algebra about as much as in Latin. Ambitious implies ambition, religio, religion, homines honesti, a set of honorable men. You have a quarrel on your hand, I see, with some of the algebraists of Paris, but proceed. I dispute the availability and thus the value of that reason which is cultivated in any especial form other than the abstractly logical. I dispute in particular the reason adduced by mathematical study. The mathematicians are the science of form and quantity. The mathematical reasoning is merely logic applied to observation upon form and quantity. The great error lies in supposing that even the truths of what is called pure algebra are abstract or general truths, and this error is so egregious that I am confounded at the universality with which it has been received. Mathematical axioms are not axioms of general truth. What is true of relation, of form and quantity, is often grossly false in regard to morals. For example, in this latter science it is very usually untrue that the aggregated parts are equal to the whole. In chemistry also the axiom fails. In the consideration of motive it fails, for two motives, each of a given value, have not necessarily a value when united, equal to the sum of their values apart. There are numerous other mathematical truths which are only truths within the limit of relation, but the mathematician argues from his finite truths through habit, as if they were an absolutely general applicability, as the world indeed imagines them to be. Bryant, in his very learned mythology, mentions an analogous source of error, when he says that although the pagan fables are not to be believed, we yet forget ourselves continually and make inferences from them as existing realities. With algebraists, however, who are pagans themselves, the pagan fables are believed, and the inferences are made, not so much through lapse of memory, as through an unaccounting addling of the brains. In short, I never yet encountered the mere mathematician who could be trusted out of equal roots, or one who did not clandestinely hold it as a point of his faith that x squared plus px was absolutely and unconditionally equal to q. Say to one of these gentlemen, by way of experiment if you please, that you believe occasions where x squared plus px is not altogether equal to q, and having made him understand what you mean, get out of his reach as speedily as convenient, for, beyond doubt, he will endeavor to knock you down. I mean to say, continued Dupin, well, I merely laughed at his last observations, that if the minister had been no more than a mathematician, the prefect would have been under no necessity for giving me this check. I knew him, however, as both a mathematician and a poet, and my measures were adapted to his capacity. With reference to the circumstances by which he was surrounded, I knew him as a courtier too, and as bold intriguant. Such a man, I considered, could not fail to be aware of the ordinary policial modes of action. He could not have failed to anticipate, and events have proved that he did not fail to anticipate, the waylayings to which he was subjected. He must have foreseen, I reflected, the secret investigations of his premises, his frequent absences from home at night, which were hailed by the prefect as certain aids to success I regarded only as ruses to afford opportunity for thorough search of the police, and thus the sooner to impress them with the conviction to which G, in fact, did finally arrive, the conviction that the letter was not upon the premises. I felt also that the whole train of thought, which I was at some pains in detailing to you just now concerning the invariable principle of policial action in searches for articles concealed, I felt that this whole train of thought would necessarily pass through the mind of the minister. He would imperatively lead them to despise all the ordinary nooks of concealment. He could not, I reflected, be so weak as not to see the most intricate and remote recess of his hotel would be as open as his commonest closets to the eyes, to the probes, to the gimlets, and to the microscopes of the prefect. I saw, in fine, that he would be driven as a matter of course to simplicity, if not deliberately induced to it as a matter of choice. You will remember, perhaps, how desperately the prefect laughed when I suggested upon our first interview that it was just possible this mystery troubled him so much on account of it being so very self-evident. Yes, I said, I remember his merriment well. I really thought he would have fallen into convulsions. The material world, continued Dupin, abounds with very strict analogies to the immaterial, and thus some color of the truth had been given to the rhetorical dogma, the metaphor, or simile that may be made to strengthen an argument, as well as to embellish a description. The principle of the vie inertiae, for example, seems to be identical in physics and metaphysics. It is not more true in the former that a large body is with more difficulty set in motion than a smaller one, and that its subsequent momentum is commensurate with this difficulty, than it is in the latter that intellectuals of the vaster capacity, while more forcible, more constant, and more eventful in their movements than those of inferior grades, are yet less readily moved and more embarrassed and full of hesitation in the first few steps of their progress. Again, have you ever noticed which of the street signs over the shop doors are the most attractive of attention? I have never given it a matter of thought, I said. There is a game of puzzles, he resumed, which is played upon a map. One party requires another to find a given word, the name of town, river, state, or empire, any word, in short, upon the motley and perplexed surface of the chart. A novice in the game generally seeks to embarrass his opponents by giving them the most minutely lettered names, but the adepts select words as stretch in large characters from one end of the chart to the other. These, like the overly large lettered signs and placard on the street, escape observation by dint of being excessively obvious. And here the physical oversight is precisely analogous with the moral inapprehension by which the intellect suffers to pass unnoticed those considerations which are too obtrusively and too palpably self-evident. But this is a point, as appears, somewhat above or beneath the understanding of the prefect. He never once thought it probable or possible that the minister had deposited the letter immediately beneath the nose of the whole world, by way of best preventing any portion of the world from perceiving it. But the more I reflected upon the daring, dashing, and discriminating ingenuity of D, upon the fact that the document must always have been at hand, if he intended to use it to its good purpose, and upon the decisive evidence obtained by the prefect that it was not hidden within the limits of the dignitary's ordinary search, the more satisfied I became that, to conceal this letter, the minister had resorted to the comprehensive and sagacious expedient of not attempting to conceal it at all. Full of these ideas, I prepared myself with a pair of green spectacles, and called one fine morning, quite by accident, at the ministerial hotel. I found D at home, yawning, lounging, and dawdling as usual, pretending to be in the last extremity of ennui. He is perhaps the most really energetic human being now alive, but that is only when nobody sees him. To be even with him, I complained of my weak eyes and lamented the necessity of the spectacles, under cover of which I cautiously and thoroughly surveyed the apartment while seemingly intent only upon the conversation of my host. I paid special attention to a large writing table near where he sat, and upon which lay confusedly some miscellaneous letters and other papers, with one or two musical instruments and a few books. Here, however, after a long and very deliberate scrutiny, I saw nothing to excite particular suspicion. At length, my eyes, in going the circuit of the room, fell upon a trumpery, filigree card rack of pasteboard that hung dangling by a dirty blue ribbon from a little brass knob just beneath the middle of the mantelpiece. In this rack, which had 3 or 4 compartments, were 5 or 6 visiting cards and a solitary letter. This last was much soiled and crumpled. It was torn nearly in two across the middle, as if by design. In the first instance, to tear it entirely up is worthless, and had been altered or stayed in the second. It had a large black seal bearing the D cipher very conspicuously, and was addressed in diminutive female hand to D. The minister himself. It was thus carelessly, and even as it seemed contemptuously, into one of the upper divisions of the rack. No sooner had I glanced at this letter than I concluded it was to be that which I was in search. To be sure, it was all to appearance radically different from what one the prefect had read us so minute a description. Here the seal was large and black with the D cipher. There it was small and red with the ducal arms of the S family. Here the address to the minister was diminutive and feminine. There the superscription to a certain royal personages was markedly bold and decided. The size alone formed a point of correspondence. But then the radicalness of these differences, which was excessive, the dirt, the soiled and torn condition of the paper so inconsistent with the true mythological habits of D, and so suggestive of a design to delude the beholder into an idea of the worthlessness of the document. These things together with the hyper-obtrusive situation of the document, full in view of every visitor, and thus exactly in accordance with the conclusions to which I have previously arrived. These things, I say, were strongly corroborative of suspicion in one who came with the intention to suspect. I protracted my visit as long as possible, and while I maintained a most animated discussion with the minister on a topic which I knew well and had never failed to interest or excite him, I kept my attention really riveted upon the letter. In this examination I committed to memory its external experience and arrangement of the rack, as also fell at length upon discovery which set at rest whatever trivial doubt I might have entertained. In scrutinizing the edges of the paper, I observed them to be more chafed than seemed necessary. They presented the broken appearance which is manifested when a stiff paper, having been once folded and pressed with a folder, is refolded in a reverse direction, in the same creases or edges which had formed the original fold. This discovery was sufficient. It was clear to me that the letter had been turned as a glove, inside out, redirected, and resealed. I bade the minister good morning, and made my departure at once, leaving a gold snuff-box upon the table. The next morning, I called for the snuff-box, when we resumed quite eagerly the conversation of the preceding day. While thus engaged, however, a loud report, as if of a pistol, was heard immediately beneath the windows of the hotel, and was succeeded by a series of fearful screams and the shoutings of a mob. D rushed to a casement, threw it open, looked out. In the meantime, I stepped to the card rack, took the letter, put it in my pocket, and replaced it by a facsimile, so far regards externals, which I had carefully prepped at my lodgings, imitating the D cipher, very readily by means of a seal formed of bread. The disturbance in the street had been occasioned by the frantic behavior of a man with a musket. He had fired it among a crowd of women and children. It proved, however, that it had been without a ball, and the fellow was suffered to go to his way as a lunatic or a drunkard. When he had gone, D came from the window. Whiter, I had seen, followed him immediately upon securing the object in view. Afterwards I bade him farewell. The pretended lunatic was a man in my own pay. But what purpose had you, I asked, in replacing the letter with a facsimile? Would it not have been better at the first visit to have seized it openly and departed? D, replied Dupin, is a desperate man and a man of nerve. His hotel, too, is not without attendants devoted to his interests. Had I made the wild attempt you suggest, I might never have left with the ministerial presence alive. The good people of Paris might have heard of me no more, but I had an object apart from these considerations. You know my political prepossessions. In this matter, I act as a partisan of the lady concerned. For 18 months the minister has had her in his power. She now has him in hers, since being unaware that the letter is not in his possession, he will proceed with the exactions as before. Thus he will inevitably commit himself at once to his political destruction. His downfall, too, will not be more precipitous than awkward. It is very well to talk about the facile descents to Savigny, but in all kinds of climbing, as Cantalli said of singing, it is more easy to get up than to come down. In the present instance, I have no sympathy, at least no pity, for him who descends. He is the monstrum horrendum, an unprincipled man of genius. I confess, however, that I should very well like to know the precise character of his thoughts, when, being defied by her whom the prefect terms a certain personages, he is reduced to opening the letter which I left for him in the card-rack. How? Did you put anything particular in it? Why, it did not seem altogether right to leave the interior blank. That would have been insulting. D, at Vienna once, did me an evil turn, which I told him quite good-humoredly that I should remember. So as I knew he would feel some curiosity in regard to the identity of the person who had outwitted him, I thought it a pity not to give him a clue. He is well acquainted with my MS, and as I copied onto the middle of the blank sheet the words "Un dessein si funeste s'il n'était d'être et d'être," these are to be found in Crébillon's Etri. And that is the Purloined. Of course, I shall not pretend to consider it any matter for wonder that the extraordinary case of M. Valdemar has excited discussion. It would have been a miracle had it not, especially under the circumstances, through the desire of all parties concerned to keep the affair from the public, at least for the present, or until we had farther opportunities for investigation. Through our endeavors to effect this, a garbled or exaggerated account made its way into society, and became the source of many unpleasant misrepresentations, and very naturally of a great deal of disbelief. It is now rendered necessary that I give the facts as far as I comprehend them myself. They are succinctly these. My attention for the last 3 years had been repeatedly drawn into the subject of mesmerism, and about 9 months ago it occurred to me, quite suddenly, that in the series of experiments made hitherto there had been a very remarkable and most unaccountable omission. No person had yet been mesmerized. In articulo mortis, it remained to be seen first whether, in such a condition, there existed in the patient any susceptibility to the magnetic influence. Secondly, whether, if any existed, it was impaired or increased by the condition. Thirdly, to what extent, or for how long of a period, the encroachments of death might be arrested by the process. There were other points to be ascertained, but these most excited my curiosity. The last is especial in the immensely important character of its consequences. In looking around me for the subject to whose means I might test these particulars, I was brought to think of my friend, M. Ernest Valdemar, who, well-known compiler of the Bibliotheca Forensica, and author under the nom de plume of Isaacar Marx, the Polish version Wallenstein and Gargantua M. Valdemar, who had resided principally in Harlem, New York since the year 1839, is, or was, particularly noticeable for the extreme spareness of his person, his lower limbs much resembling those of John Randolph, and also for the whiteness of his whiskers, in violent contrast to the blackness of his hair, the latter in consequence being very generally mistaken for a wig. His temperament was markedly nervous, and I rendered him a good subject for a mesmeric experiment. On 2 or 3 occasions I had put him to sleep with little difficulty, but was disappointed in other results, which his peculiar constitution had naturally led me to anticipate. His will was at no period positively or thoroughly under my control, and in regard to clairvoyance, I could accomplish with him nothing to be relied upon. I always attributed my failures at these points to the disordered state of his health. For some months previous to my becoming acquainted with him, his physicians had declared him in a confirmed phthisis. It was his custom indeed to speak calmly of his approaching dissolution as a matter neither to be avoided nor regretted. When the ideas to which I had alluded first occurred to me, it was of course very natural that I should think Valdemar. I knew the study philosophy of the man too well to apprehend any scruples from him, and he had no relatives in America who were likely to interfere. I spoke to him frankly upon the subject, and to my surprise, his interest seemed vividly excited. I say to my surprise, for although he had always yielded his person freely to my experiments, he had never before given me any tokens of sympathy with what I did. His disease was that of character which would admit an exact calculation in respect to the epoch of its termination in death, and it was finally arranged between us that he would send for me about 24 hours before the period announced by his physicians as that of his decease. It is now rather more than 7 months since I was received by Valdemar himself the subjoined note. My dear P, you may as well come now. D and F are agreed that I cannot hold out beyond tomorrow night, and I think they have hit the time very nearly. Valdemar. I received this note within half an hour it was written, and in 15 more minutes I was in the dying man's chamber. I had not seen him for 10 days, and was appalled by the fearful alteration which the brief interval had wrought in him. His face wore a leaden hue, his eyes were utterly lustreless, and the emaciation was so extreme that the skin had been broken through by the cheekbones. His expectoration was excessive. The pulse was barely perceptible. He retained, nevertheless, in a very remarkable manner, both his mental power and a certain degree of physical strength. He spoke with distinctness, took some palliative medicines without aid. When I entered, the room was occupied in penciling memoranda in a pocketbook. He was propped up in the bed by pillows. Doctors D and F were in attendance. After pressing Valdemar's hand, I took these gentlemen aside and obtained from them a minute account of the patient's condition. The left lung had for 18 months been in a semi-osseous or cartilaginous state, and was of course entirely useless for all purposes of vitality. The right, in its upper portion, was also partially, not thoroughly, ossified, while the lower region was merely a mass of purulent tubercles, running one into another. Several extensive perforations existed, and at one point permanent adhesion to the ribs had taken place. These appearances in the right lobe were comparatively recent date. The ossification had proceeded with very unusual rapidity. No sign of it had discovered a month before, and the adhesion had only been observed during the 3 days previous. Independently of the phthisis, the patient was suspected of aneurysm in the aorta, but on this point the osseous symptoms rendered an exact diagnosis impossible. Was the opinion of both physicians that Valdemar would die about midnight on the morrow, Sunday. It was 7 o'clock on Saturday morning. On quitting the invalid's bedside to hold conversation with myself, Doctors D and F had bidden him a final farewell. It had not been their intention to return, but, at my request, they agreed to look in upon the patient about 10 the next night. When they had gone, I spoke freely with Valdemar on the subject of his approaching dissolution, as well as more particularly on the experiment proposed. He still professed himself quite willing and even anxious to have it made, and urged me to commence it at once. A male and a female nurse were in attendance, but I did not feel myself altogether at liberty to engage in a task of this character with no more reliable witnesses than these 2 people, in case of a sudden accident, might prove. I therefore postponed operations until about 8 the next night, when the arrival of a medical student with whom I had some acquaintance, Mr. Theodore L., relieved me from my furthest embarrassment. It had been my design originally to wait for the physicians, but I was induced to proceed first by the urgent entreaties by M. Valdemar, and second by my conviction that I had not a moment to lose, as he was evidently sinking fast. Mr. L. was so kind as to accede to my desire that he would take notes of all that occurred, and it was from his memoranda that I now have to relate is, for the most part, entirely condensed or copied verbatim. It wanted about 5 minutes of 8 when, taking the patient's hand, I begged him to state as distinctly as he could to Mr. L. whether he, M. Valdemar, was entirely willing that I should make the experiment of mesmerizing him in his then condition. He replied feebly, quite audibly, yes, I wish to be mesmerized, adding immediately afterwards, I fear you have delayed too long. While he spoke thus, I commenced the passes which I had already found most effectual in subduing him. He was evidently influenced with the first lateral stroke of my hand across his forehead, but although I exerted all my powers, no farther perceptible effect was induced until some minutes after 10 o'clock, when Doctors D and F called according to the appointment. I explained to them in a few words what I had designed, and as they opposed no objection, saying that it was the patient was already in death agony, I proceeded without hesitation, exchanging, however, the lateral passes for downward ones and directing my gaze entirely into the right eye of the sufferer. By this time his pulse was imperceptible, and his breathing was stertorous, and at intervals of half a minute. The condition was nearly unaltered for a quarter of an hour. At the expiration of this period, however, a natural, although a very deep sigh escaped the bosom of the dying man, and the stertorous breathing ceased. That is to say, its stertorousness was no longer apparent, the intervals were undiminished, the patient's extremities were of an icy coldness. At 5 minutes before 11, I perceived unequivocal signs of the mesmeric influence. The glassy roll of the eye was changed for the expression of uneasy inward examination, which is never seen except in cases of sleepwalking, and which is quite impossible to mistake. Within a few rapid lateral passes, I made the lids quiver as the incipient slept, and with a few more I closed them altogether. I was not satisfied, however, with this, but continued the manipulations vigorously and with the fullest exertion of my will, until I completely stiffened the limbs of the slumberer, after placing them in a seamlessly easy position. The legs were at full length, the arms were nearly so, and reposed on the bed at a moderate distance from the loins. The head was very slightly elevated. When I had accomplished this, it was fully midnight, and I requested the gentlemen present to examine M. Valdemar's condition. After a few experiments, they admitted him to be in an unusually perfect state of mesmeric trance. The curiosity of both the physicians was greatly excited. Dr. D resolved at once to remain with the patient all night, while Dr. F took leave with a promise to return at daybreak. Mr. L and the nurses remained. We left M. Valdemar completely undisturbed until about 3 o'clock in the morning, when I approached him and found him in precisely the same condition when Dr. F went away. That is to say, he lay in the same position, the pulse was imperceptible, the breathing was gentle, scarcely noticeable unless through the application of a mirror to the lips. The eyes were closed naturally, and the limbs were as rigid as cold as marble. Still, the general appearance was certainly not that of death. As I approached M. Valdemar, I made a kind of half-effort to influence his right arm into pursuit of my own, as I passed the latter gently to and fro above his person. In such experiments with this patient, I had never perfectly succeeded before, and assuredly I had little thought of succeeding now. But to my astonishment, his arm very readily, although feebly, followed every direction assigned it with mine. I determined to hazard a few words of conversation. M. Valdemar, I said, are you asleep? He made no answer, but I perceived a tremor about the lips, and was thus induced to repeat the question, again and again. At its third repetition, his whole frame was agitated by a very slight shivering, The eyelids unclosed themselves so far as to display the white line of the ball. The lips moved sluggishly, and from between them in a barely audible whisper issued the words, "Yes, awake now. Do not wake me. Let me die so." I here felt the limbs and found them as rigid as ever. The right arm, as before, obeyed the direction of my hand. I questioned the sleepwaker again. "Do you still feel a pain in the breast, Mr. M. Valdemar?" The answer was now immediate, but even less audible than before. "No pain. I am dying." I did not think it advisable to disturb him farther just then, and nothing more was said or done until the arrival of Dr. F., who came a little before sunrise, and expressed unbounded astonishment at finding the patient still alive. After feeling the pulse and applying a mirror to the lips, he requested me to speak to the sleepwalker again. I did so, saying, "M. Valdemar, do you still sleep?" As before, some minutes elapsed ere a reply was made, and during the interval, the dying man seemed to be collecting his energies to speak. At my fourth repetition of the question, he said very faintly, almost inaudibly, "Yes, still asleep. Dying." It was now the opinion, or rather the wish of the physicians, that M. Valdemar should be suffered to remain undisturbed in his present apparently tranquil condition until death should supervene, and this, it was generally agreed, must now take place within a few minutes. I concluded, however, to speak with him once more and merely repeat my previous question. While I spoke, there came a marked change over the countenance of the sleepwaker. The eyes rolled themselves slowly opened, the pupils disappearing upwardly, the skin generally assumed a cadaverous hue, resembling not so much parchment as white paper, and the circular hectic spots which hitherto had been strongly defined in the center of each cheek went out at once. I use this expression because the suddenness of their departure put me in a mind of nothing so much as the extinguishment of a candle by a puff of the breath. The upper lip at the same time writhed itself away from the teeth, which had previously covered completely, while the lower jaw fell with an audible jerk, leaving the mouth widely extended and disclosing in full view the swollen and blackened tongue. I presume that no member of the party then present had been unaccustomed to deathbed horrors, but so hideous beyond conception was the appearance of M. Valdemar at this moment, that there was a general shrinking back from the region of the bed. I now feel that I have reached a point of this narrative for which every reader will be startled into positive disbelief. It is my business, however, simply to proceed. There was no longer the faintest sign of vitality in M. Valdemar, and concluding him to be dead, we were consigning him to charge of the nurses, when a strong vibratory motion was observable in the tongue. This continued for perhaps a minute. At the expiration of this period, there issued from the distended and motionless jaws a voice, such as it would be madness in me to attempt describing. There are indeed 2 or 3 epithets which might be considered as applicable to this part. I might say, for example, the sound was harsh and broken and hollow, but the hideous whole is indescribable, for the simple reason that no similar sounds have ever jarred upon the ear of humanity. There were 2 particulars, nevertheless, which I thought then, and still think, might fairly be stated as characteristic of the intonation, as well as adapted to convey some idea its unearthly peculiarity. In the first place, the voice seemed to reach our ears, at least mine, from a vast distance, or from some deep cavern within the earth. In the second place, it impressed me. I fear indeed that it will be impossible to make myself comprehended as gelatinous or glutinous. Matters impress the sense of touch. I have spoken both of sound and of voice. I mean to say the sound was one of distinct or even wonderfully thrilling distinct syllabification. And Valdemar spoke, obviously, in reply to the question I had propounded to him a few minutes before. I asked him, it will be remembered, if he still slept. He now said, "Yes, no, I have been sleeping." and now I am dead. No person present ever affected to deny or attempted to repress the unutterable shuddering horror which these few words thus uttered were so well calculated to convey. Mr. L., the student, swooned. The nurses immediately left the chamber and could not be induced to return. My own impressions I would not pretend to render intelligible to the reader. For nearly an hour we busied ourselves silently, without the utterance of a word, in endeavors to revive Mr. L. When he came to himself, we addressed ourselves again in the investigation of M. Valdemar's condition. It remained in all respects as I have last described it, with the exception that the mirror no longer afforded evidence of respiration. An attempt to draw blood from the arm failed. I should mention, too, that the limb was no farther subject to my will. I endeavored in vain to make it follow the direction of my hand. The only real indication, indeed, of the mesmeric influence was now found in the vibratory movement of the tongue. Whenever I addressed M. Valdemar with a question, he seemed to be making an effort to reply, but no longer had sufficient volition. To queries put to him by any other person than myself, he seemed utterly insensible. Although I endeavored to place each member of the company in mesmeric rapport with him, I believe that I have now related all that is necessary to an understanding of the sleepwaker's state at this epoch. Other nurses were procured, and at 10 o'clock I left the house in company with the 2 physicians and Mr. L. In the afternoon, we all called again to see the patient. His condition remained precisely the same. We had now some discussion as to the propriety and feasibility of waking him, but we had little difficulty in agreeing that no good purpose would be served by doing so. It was evident that, so far, death, or what is usually termed death, had been arrested by the mesmeric process. It seemed clear to us all that to awaken M. Valdemar would be merely to ensure his instant, or at least his speedy, dissolution. From this period until the close of the last week, an interval of nearly 7 months, we continued to make daily calls at M. Valdemar's house, accompanied now and then by medical and other friends. All this time, the sleepwaker remained exactly as I have last described him. The nurse's attentions were continual. It was on Friday last that we finally resolved to make the experiment of awakening, or attempting to awaken him, and it is the perhaps unfortunate result of this latter experiment which has given rise to so much discussion in private circles, to so much of what I cannot help thinking unwarranted popular feeling. For the purpose of relieving M. Valdemar from the mesmeric trance, I made use of the customary passes. These, for a time, were unsuccessful. The first indication of revival was afforded by a partial descent of the iris. It was observed as especially remarkable that the lowering of the pupil was accompanied by the profuse outflowing of yellowish ichor from beneath the lids, of a pungent and highly offensive odor. It was now suggested that I should attempt to influence the patient's arm. As heretofore I had the attempt and failed, Dr. F. then intimated a desire to have me put a question. I did so as follows. M. Valdemar, can you explain to us what your feelings or wishes now? There was an instant return of the hectic circles on the cheeks. The tongue quivered, or rather rolled violently in the mouth, although the jaws and lips remained rigid as before. And at length the same hideous voice that I've already described broke forth. For God's sake, quick, quick, put me to sleep, or quick, waken me, quick. I say to you, I am dead. I was thoroughly unnerved, and for an instant remained undecided what to do. At first I made an endeavor to recompose the patient, but failing in this through abeyance of the will, I retraced my steps as earnestly struggled to awaken him. In this attempt, I soon saw I should be successful, or at least I should fancy that my success would be complete, and I'm sure all in the room were prepared to see the patient awaken. For what really occurred, however, it is quite impossible that any human being could have been prepared. As I rapidly made the mesmeric passes, amid ejaculations of "dead, dead. Absolutely bursting from the tongue and not from the lips of the sufferer, his whole frame at once, within the space of a single minute, or even less, shrunk, crumbled, absolutely rotted away beneath my hands. Upon the bed before that whole company, there lay a nearly liquid mass of loathsome, of detestable putridity. And that is the chateau in which my valet had ventured to make forcible entrance rather than permit me in my desperately wounded condition to pass a night in the open air was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have so long frowned among the Apennines, not less in fact the fancy Mrs. Radcliffe. To all appearance it had been temporarily and very largely abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments. It lay in a remote turret of the building. Its decorations were rich, yet tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestry, and bedecked with manifold and multiform amoral trophies, together with an unusually great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which depended from the walls, not only in their main surfaces, but in very many nooks which the bizarre architecture of the chateau rendered necessary, in these paintings, my incipient delirium perhaps had caused me to take deep interest, so that I bade Pedro to close the heavy shutters of the room, since it was already night, to light the tongues of a tall candelabrum, which stood by the head of my bed, and throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of black velvet which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, at least alternatively, to the contemplation of these pictures and the perusal of a small volume which had been found upon the pillow, and which purported to criticize and describe them. Long I read, and devotedly I gazed. Rapidly and gloriously the hours flew by, and the deep midnight came. The position of the candelabrum displeased me, and outreaching my hand with difficulty, rather than disturb my slumbering valet, I placed it so as to throw its rays more fully upon the book. But the action produced an effect altogether unanticipated. The rays of the numerous candles, for there were many, now fell within a niche of the room which had hitherto been thrown into deep shade by one of the bedposts. I saw in vivid light a picture all unnoticed before. It was the portrait of a young girl, just ripening into womanhood. I glanced at the painting hurriedly, and then closed my eyes. Why I did this was not at first apparent even to my own perception. But while my lids remained thus shut, I ran over in my mind my reason for so shutting them. It was an impulsive movement to gain time for thought, to make sure that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. In a very few moments I again looked fixedly at the painting. That I now saw aright, I could not and would not doubt, for the first flashing of the candles upon the canvas had seemed to dissipate the dreamy stupor in which stealing over my senses, and to startle me once into waking life. The portrait, I had already said, was that of a young girl. It was a mere head and shoulders, done in what is technically termed a vignette manner, much in the style of my favorite heads of Sully. The arms and the bosom, and even the ends of the radiant hair melted imperceptibly into the vague yet deep shadow which formed the background of the whole. The frame was oval, richly gilded and filigreed in Moresque. As a thing of art, nothing could be more admirable than the painting itself, but it could have been neither the execution of the work nor the immortal beauty of the countenance, which had been so suddenly and so vehemently moved me. Least of all could have been that my fancy, shaken from its half-slumber, had mistaken the head for that of a living person. I saw at once that the peculiarities of the design of the vignetting, and of the frame must have instantly dispelled such ideas, must have prevented even its momentary entertainment. Thinking earnestly upon these points, I remained for an hour perhaps, half sitting, half reclining, with my vision riveted upon the portrait. At length, satisfied with the true secret of its effect, I fell back within the bed. I had found the spell of the picture in an absolute life-likeness of expression, which, at first startling, finally confounded, subdued, and appalled me. With deep and reverent awe, I replaced the candelabrum in its former position. The cause of my deep agitation being thus shut from view, I sought eagerly the volume which discussed the paintings and their histories. Turning to the number which designated the oval portrait, I read the vague and quaint words which follow. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee, and evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. He, passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art, she, a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee, all light and smiles and frolicsome as the young fawn, loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art which was her rival, dreading only the palette and brushes and other untoward instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to betray even his young bride. But she was humble and obedient, and sat meekly for many weeks in the dark, high turret chamber, where the light dripped upon the pale canvas only from overhead. But he, the painter, took glory in his work, which went on from hour to hour and from day to day, and he was a passionate and wild and moody man, who became lost in reveries, so that he would not see that the light which fell so ghastly in that lone turret withered the health and the spirits of his bride, who pined visibly to all but him. Yet she smiled on and still on, uncomplainingly, because she saw that the painter, who had high renown, took a fervid and burning pleasure in his task, and wrought day and night to depict her who so loved him, yet who grew daily more dispirited and weak. And in sooth, some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words, as of a mighty marvel, and of proof not less of the power of the painter than of his deep love for whom he depicted so surpassingly well. But at length, as the labor drew nearer to its conclusion, there were admitted none into the turret, for the painter had grown wild with the ardor of his work, and turned his eyes from canvas merely, even to regard the countenance of his wife, and he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. And when many weeks had passed, but little remained to do so save one brush upon the mouth, and one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up as the flame within the socket of the lamp, and then the brush was given, and the tint was placed, and for one moment the painter stood entranced before his work which he had wrought. But the next, while he gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid and aghast, and crying with a loud voice, "This is indeed life itself," turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. The thousand injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who will know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length, I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled, but the very definitiveness to which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato, although in other regards he is meant to be respected and even feared. He prided himself in his connoisseurship in wine. Few Italians have the true virtuoso spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adopted to suit the time and opportunity to practice imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires. In painting and gemmery, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack. But in the matter of old wines, he was sincere. In this respect, I did not differ from him materially. I was skillful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely whenever I could. It was about dusk one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting, party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today, but I have received what passes for a pipe of Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" said he. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible. And in the middle of the carnival." "I have my doubts," I replied, "and I was fearful enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were nowhere to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain. Amontillado! I have my doubts. Amontillado! And I must satisfy them. Amontillado! As you are engaged, on my way to Lucchese. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell Lucchese cannot tell Amontillado from sherry. And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. Come, let us go." "Whither?" "To your vaults." "My friend, no. I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement, Lucchese." "I have no engagement. Come." "My friend, no. It is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you are afflicted. The vaults are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with nitre." "Let us go, nevertheless. The cold is a mere nothing. Amontillado! You have been imposed upon, and as for Lucchese, he cannot distinguish sherry from Amontillado." Thus speaking, Fortunato possessed himself of my arm, and putting on a mask of black silk and drawing a roquelaire closely about my person, I suffered him to hurry me to my palazzo. There were no attendants at home. They had absconded to make merry in honor of the time. I had told them that I should not return until the morning, and had given them explicit orders not to stir from the house. These orders were sufficient, I well knew, to ensure their immediate disappearance, one and all, as soon as my back was turned. I took from their sconces 2 flambeaux, and giving one to Fortunato, bowed him through several suites of rooms to the archway that led into the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent, and stood together upon the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode. "The pipe," said he. "It is farther on," said I, "but observe the white webwork which gleams from these cavern walls." He turned towards me and looked me in the eyes with 2 filmy orbs that distilled the rheum of intoxication. "Nitre?" he asked at length. "Nitre," I replied. "How long have you had that cough?" My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes. "It is nothing," he said at last. "Come," I said with decision, "we will go back. Your health is precious. You are rich, respected, admired. You are happy, as once I was. You are a man to be missed. For me it is no matter. We will go back. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible." Lucchese, "Enough," he said. "The cough is a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I will not die of a cough." "True, true," I replied. and indeed I had no intention of alarming you unnecessarily, but you should use all proper caution. A draught of this Medoc will defend us from the damps. Here I knocked off the neck of a bottle which I drew from a long row of its fellows that lay upon the mould. Drink, I said, presenting him the wine. He raised it to his lips with a leer. He paused and nodded to me familiarly, while his bells jingled. I drink, he said, to the buried that repose around us, and I to your long life. He took my arm, and we proceeded. These vaults, he said, are extensive. The Montresors, I replied, were a great and numerous family. I forget your arms. A huge human foot d'or in a field azure. The foot crushes a serpent rampant whose fangs are embedded in the heel. And the motto, Nemo me impune lacessit. Good, he said. The wine sparkled in his eyes and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the Medoc. We had passed through long walls of piled skeletons, with casks and puncheons intermingling into the inmost recesses of the catacombs. I paused again, and this time I made bold to seize Fortunato by an arm above the elbow. The nitre, I said, see, it increases. It hangs like moss upon the vaults. We are below the river's bed. The drops of moisture trickle among the bones. Come, we will go back ere it is too late. Your cough. It is nothing, he said. Let us go on, but first another draught of the Medoc. I broke and reached him a flacon de grave. He emptied it at a breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light, and he laughed and threw the bottle upwards with a gesticulation I did not understand. I looked at him in surprise. He repeated the movement, a grotesque one. You do not comprehend, he said. Not I replied. Then you are not of the Brotherhood. How? You are not of the Masons. Yes, I said, yes. You, a Mason, impossible. A Mason, I replied. A sign, he said, a sign. It is this, I replied, producing from beneath the fold of my roquelaire a trowel. You jest, he exclaimed, recoiling a few paces. But let us proceed to the Amontillado. Be it so, I said, replacing the tool beneath the cloak and again offering him my arm. He leaned upon it heavily. We continued our route in search of the Amontillado. We passed through a range of low arches, descended, passed on, descended again, arrived at a deep crypt in which the foulness of the air caused our flambeaux rather to glow than flame. At the most remote end of the crypt there appeared another less spacious. Its walls had been lined with human remains, piled to the vault overhead in the fashion of the great catacombs of Paris. 3 sides of this interior crypt were still ornamented in this manner. From the 4th side the bones had been thrown down and lay promiscuously upon the earth, forming at one point a mound of some size. Within the walls thus exposed by the displacing of the bones we perceived a still interior crypt or recess, in depth about 4 feet, in width 3, in height 6 or 7. It seemed to have been constructed for no especial use within itself, but for merely the interval between 2 of the colossal supports of the roof of the catacombs, and was backed by one of their circumscribing walls of solid granite. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavored to pry into the depths of the recess. Its termination the feeble light did not enable us to see. Proceed, I said. Herein is the Amontillado. As for Lucchesi, he is an ignoramus, interrupted my friend as he stepped unsteadily forward. While I followed immediately at his heels. In an instant he had reached the extremity of the niche, and finding his progress arrested by the rock, stood stupidly bewildered. A moment more, and I had fettered him to the granite. In its surface were 2 iron staples, distant from each other about 2 feet horizontally. From one of these depended a short chain, from the other a padlock. Throwing the links about his waist, it was but the work of a few seconds to secure it. He was much too astounded to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back from the recess. Pass your hand, I said, over the wall. You cannot help feeling the nitre. Indeed, it is very damp. But more. Let me implore you to return. No. Then I must positively leave you. But I must first render you all the little attentions in my power. The Amontillado, ejaculated my friend, not yet recovered from his astonishment. True, I replied. The Amontillado. As I said these words, I busied myself along the pile of bones of which I had before spoken. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials, and with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of the masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had, in great measure, worn off. The earliest indication I had to this was a low moaning cry from the depths of the recess. It was not the cry of a drunken man. There was then a long and obstinate silence. I laid the second tier, and third, and the fourth, and then I heard the furious vibrations of the chain. The noise lasted for several minutes, during which that I might hearken to it with more satisfaction. I ceased my labors, and sat down upon the bones, and when at last the clanking subsided, I resumed the trowel and finished without interruption the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh tier. The wall was now nearly upon a level with my breast. I again paused, and holding the flambeau over the mason work, threw a few feeble rays of light to the figure within. A succession of loud and shrill screams bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form seemed to thrust me violently back. For a brief moment I hesitated, I trembled. Unsheathing my rapier, I began to grope about it with the passage. But the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs and felt satisfied. I reapproached the wall. I replied to the yells of he who clamored. I re-echoed. I aided. I surpassed them in volume and in strength. I did this, and the clamorer grew still. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position, but now there came from out the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty in recognizing, of that of the once noble Fortunato. The voice said, "A very good joke indeed, an excellent jest. We will have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo. Over our wine." "The Amontillado," I said. "Yes, the Amontillado. But is it not getting late? Will not they be waiting us at the palazzo, the Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone." "Yes," I said. "Let us be gone." "For the love of God, Montresor." "Yes," I said. "For the love of God." But to these words I hearkened in vain for reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud, "Fortunato!" No answer. I called again, "Fortunato!" No answer still. I thrust the torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in reply only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick. It was the dampness of the catacombs that made it so. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century no mortal had disturbed them. In pace requiescat. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels, and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask what is it. Let us go and make our visit. In the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, that fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing there was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. And indeed, there will be time for the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. There will be time to murder and create, and time for all the works and days of hands that lift and drop a question on your plate. Time for you, and time for me, and time yet for 100 indecisions, and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. In the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. And indeed there will be time to wonder, do I dare? And do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair, and they will say, how his hair is growing thin. My morning coat, my collar mounting firmly to the chin, my necktie rich and modest, but asserted by a simple pin. They will say, but how his arms and legs are thin. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions which a minute will reverse. For I have known them all already, known them all. I have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. I know the voices dying with the dying fall beneath the music from a further room. So how shall I presume? And I've known the eyes already, known them all. The eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase, and when I am formulated sprawling on a pin, when I'm pinned and wriggling on the wall, then how should I begin to spit out all the butt ends of my days and ways, and how should I presume? And I have known the arms already, known them all, arms that are braceleted and white and bare, when the lamplight downed with light brown hair. Is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress? Arms that lie along a table or wrap about a shawl, and should I then presume? And how should I begin? Shall I say I have gone at dusk through narrow streets and watched the smoke that rises from the pipes of lonely men in shirt sleeves leaning out of windows? No, I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas, and the afternoon, the evening, sleeps so peacefully, smoothed by long fingers, asleep, tired, or it malingers. Stretched on the floor, here beside you and me, should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force this moment to its crisis? But though I have wept and fasted, wept and prayed, though I've seen my head, grown slightly bald, brought in upon a platter, no profit, and here is no great matter. I have seen the moment of my greatness flicker, and I have seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker. And in short, I was afraid, and would have been worth it after all, after the cups, the marmalade, the tea among the porcelain, among some talk of you and me. Would have been worthwhile to have bitten off the matter with a smile, to have squeezed the universe into a ball, to roll it towards some overwhelming question, to say, I am Lazarus, come from the dead, come back to tell you all. I shall tell you all. If one settling a pillow by her head should say, that is not what I meant at all, that is not it at all, and would have been worth it after all, would have been worthwhile after the sunsets and the dooryards and the sprinkled streets, after the novels, after the teacups, after the skirts that trail along the floor. And this, and so much more, it's impossible to say just what I mean, as if a magic lantern threw the nerves and patterns on a screen, would have been worthwhile if one, settling a pillow or throwing off a shawl, and turning towards the window should say, "That is not what I meant at all. That is not it at all. No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. I'm an attendant lord, one that will do just for the progress, start a scene or two, advise the prince, no doubt an easy tool, differential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious, and meticulous, full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse, at times indeed, almost ridiculous, almost at times, the fool. Oh, I grow old, I grow old. I should wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I pop my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing, each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. I have seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back when the wind blows the water white and black. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea, by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us, and we drown. And that